Welcome back to Take Action News, everybody. You know, as a member of the mainstream media for so many years, I take a great interest in what some of my colleagues and friends and how they cover some of the stories of our times. One of the big stories of our times, of course, has been Ed Snowden, the government employee who did work for the CIA and NSA, who blew the lid on the incredible amount of data that our government is collecting on all of us, our phone calls, our movements on the internet, our actions online, all of this. He was the one, with the help of the Guardian newspaper, who blew the lid on the government activities and has sparked this debate about privacy that we are having now. Along the way, there have been some questions, I suppose, for Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald is this journalist for the Guardian who got the big scoop in all of this, did some terrific reporting. He weighed what should be part of the public discourse. He kept certain things out of public discourse in order to try to help the issues of sort of national security. And I think Glenn Greenwald did an admirable job. Nonetheless, there are some questions about the extent to which Glenn Greenwald has been an advocate. And Glenn has made it very clear he is perfectly willing to answer questions, to take on questions about his role, about what actions he has taken. And so that's fine. I salute Glenn Greenwald. I salute Ed Snowden for what he has done. We can all argue and disagree about whether Snowden should be tried in the United States or face espionage charges. I think he should not. I think we owe him a debt of gratitude for being a whistleblower in all this. Nonetheless, some questions for everybody that I think deserve to be answered. And so there was Glenn Greenwald on Meet the Press the other week, answering questions from David Gregory, and the interview was proceeding with David Gregory asking about different issues with Snowden. And then at the end, instead of just asking Glenn Greenwald, hey, did you aid and abet Snowden? Did you cross a line? If you acknowledge that Snowden broke the law, did you aid and abet him by some of the actions that you and others have taken? Instead of asking him that question, David Gregory posited the question as if Glenn Greenwald had already aided and abetted and possibly broke the law. Here's the exchange.
To the extent that you have aided and abetted Snowden, even in his current movements, why shouldn't you, Mr. Greenwald, be charged with a crime?
I think it's pretty extraordinary that anybody who would call himself a journalist would publicly muse about whether or not other journalists should be charged with felonies. The assumption in your question, David, is completely without evidence, the idea that I've aided and abetted him in any way. The scandal that arose in Washington before our stories began was about the fact that the Obama administration is trying to criminalize investigative journalism by going through the emails and phone records of AP reporters, accusing a Fox News journalist of the theory that you just embraced, being a co-conspirator with felonies for working with sources. If you want to embrace that theory, it means that every investigative journalist in the United States who works with their sources, who receives classified information, is a criminal. And it's precisely those theories and precisely that climate that has become so menacing in the United States. It's why the New Yorker's Jane Mayer said investigative reporting has come to a standstill, her word, as a result of the theories that you just referenced.
Well, the question of who's a journalist may be up to a debate with regard to what you're doing. And, of course, anybody who's watching this understands I was asking a question. That question has been raised by lawmakers as well. I'm not embracing anything, but obviously I take your point.
Now, a couple of issues here. When David Gregory says that this is a debate over whether Glenn Greenwald is a journalist, that's a bit of a stretch, because the fact of the matter is Glenn Greenwald was doing exactly what Bart Gellman was doing at the Washington Post. Bart Gellman was also relying on information from Snowden and others to try to publish information about what our government was doing. And the fact of the matter is David Gregory didn't call out Bart Gellman for not being a journalist. It's only Glenn Greenwald that gets this question. Secondly, in terms of the debate about whether or not a journalist should be charged, there aren't lawmakers, plural, that I know of that are making this point. It's only Representative Peter King, who, by the way, was making that argument based on incorrect information that he had about information that Snowden had about the CIA. So the fundamental basis for King's point was in error, and yet David Gregory is making sort of a vague reference to lawmakers, plural, without identifying who the lawmakers are when he's making this statement on national television to Glenn Greenwald. So that's the second problem that I have with David Gregory. And then the third one is the one that we sort of, a lot of people have already addressed. And that is when David Gregory, or anybody for that matter, and the fact is, I like David Gregory personally. I don't always agree with how he handles things professionally. But when he says, to the extent that you have aided and abetted Snowden, that does get into, well, to the extent that you're still beating your wife, it puts something out there that is simply unfair, that is not substantiated. And the better way that David Gregory and other journalists should have handled this, and in fact there were other journalists who had questions of Glenn Greenwald who did handle it appropriately, is they simply said, look, what did you do to help Ed Snowden get away from authorities or to help his movements? Specifically, have you done this or have you done that? Have you aided and abetted? Ask him the question. That provides more information and reveals more than simply saying, well, to the extent that you've aided and abetted, shouldn't you be charged? No, because that then interjects David Gregory's opinion or something that he believes is worthy of having the platform of Meet the Press. And that's why David Gregory got hammered over the past week. That's why you had folks like Frank Rich and other people across the media spectrum who said that what David Gregory did was highly inappropriate and that David Gregory, of all people, should not be one declaring who's a journalist and who's not a journalist.
And one of those people, David Shuster, was you, of course, and you made the brilliant point, which is that, as you pointed out, and as you schooled Gregory for doing back a few months ago, he himself broke the law as a journalist when he took an illegal ammo clip across state lines from Virginia into the District of Columbia, despite the fact that the police chief had expressly forbade his producer from doing it. And then, of course, he got off scot-free because the District of Columbia dropped those charges. So that in itself was the height of hypocrisy. And I applaud you, David, and that tweet went viral with more than 500 retweets at last count I checked, and I think probably more than 1,000. But
yeah, it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek to say, look, David Gregory, you shouldn't be the one suggesting that maybe other people should be facing any charges when David Gregory himself faced possible charges and then prosecutors decided not to prosecute him after all or indict him or bring charges.